Good evening, everyone. My name is Carol Kellerman, and I am flattered and honored to have been given the opportunity to welcome you to this in-person session of the Harvard Hillel Speaker Series, a discussion between Harvard Hillel's Donnie Passow and Jewish Museum Director Jim Snyder. Donnie will be introducing Jim as part of their talk, so I will tell you a bit about Donnie. But first, how did I come to be the person starting this program? I am a graduate of Harvard College and law school, but when I was a student in the mid-'70s, I never participated in any Hillel activities or programs, nor did any of my Jewish friends. 45 years later, during COVID, when we were all stuck in our homes, I started watching then Harvard chaplain and Hillel Rabbi Donnie Passow conduct weekly discussions with Harvard professors and others about themes derived from the weekly Parsha. And I loved these programs. I also zoomed in to the high holiday services instead of those of my own synagogue. Then I began zooming into Rabbi Donnie's Torah study classes, as well as continuing with the speaker series, which is open, both are open to current students, alumni, and friends. And I frequently invite others who I think would be interested to participate in these programs online, and I urge every one of you to take a look at them as well. The sessions Donnie creates are timely and accessible to those with all levels of Jewish education. His speaker series has reached an audience of over 15,000 and has included an amazing array of guests in lively and fascinating conversations, and he has one coming up in a couple of weeks with Bret Stephens. His weekly Jewish Studies Torah class explores the meaning of the Torah and other foundational Jewish texts in a way that is especially appropriate and helpful in these days when we're all thinking deeply about our beliefs and values and how to live by them in an extremely challenging time. In addition to being an ordained rabbi and now the senior director of public and alumni programs at Harvard Hillel, where he served for over 11 years, Donnie is also an experienced and published biostatistician with a master's in science from Harvard and a bachelor's in engineering from Cooper Union. I'm grateful to say that we've become friends, and I am happy to offer him input and reactions as he develops his programming, which I believe provides valuable outreach to Harvard's wide range of Jewish alumni everywhere across the world who can maintain, or belatedly like me, very belatedly, find a community at Harvard Hillel. And now I turn the program over to Rabbi Donnie Passow.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's really been such a pleasure to begin our friendship over these past couple of years. I want to begin with some notes of gratitude. First, to the Jewish Museum for hosting this event, and to their entire team, which is really an incredible team. So thank you, Nellie and Rachel and Ellen, and of course to James, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I want to thank Claudia Davidoff and Joseph Kahan, who are sponsoring this program in honor of James. They're close friends of his. To my colleague, Celine Ginsberg, who did so much behind the scenes. To our board member, Linda Busgang, who also helped out. And to the entire host committee. Maybe in August, I got a text message from my then colleague, Barbara Gross, and she linked to an article in the New York Times that featured James, and she said, "You should have James on the Harvard Hillel Speaker Series." So the way that typically works is I start thinking about what's my connection to a person. Who do I know who knows them to make that ask? And the next day, I was at a wedding of a student, Theo Motzkin, and I was sitting in the back left. And off at about 2 o'clock, I saw this beautiful white head of hair, and I said, "That is the hair from the New York Times from yesterday." I then went over to James, and we began a conversation which over many months led to where we are here this evening. James began his tenure here at the Jewish Museum as the Helen Goldsmith and Menschel Director in November of 2023, after serving since 2019 as Executive Chair of the Jerusalem Foundation. He He's also Director Emeritus of the Israel Museum and a Senior Fellow of the Middle East Initiative at Harvard's Kennedy School. During his tenure as Director of the Israel Museum, James led the museum through the most dramatic period of growth since its founding and secured its stature as one of the world's foremost museums. Prior to his appointment at the Israel Museum, Snyder held a number of positions at the Museum of Modern Art, culminating as Deputy Director from 1986 to 1996. He is a member of the Harvard class of 1973. Please join me in welcoming James. James told me that when he left the museum here in the Museum of Modern Art in New York to go to Israel, basically every one of his colleagues there told him that he shouldn't make that move, except for one, Linda Zeicherman, who is a childhood friend of my mother, so that's an extra special connection. James, I want to begin with asking you a question which I know you love to begin by asking others, which is, what's your story? And especially since becoming the director here at the Jewish Museum.
Happy to answer that. A few things first. First of all, it's great to see this room. This room is full every night of the week. It's fantastic. You know, October 7 triggered so much bad stuff, but what it's done for us is to fill this space 3 nights a week, just like this, for conversations like this. And it's great to have all of you here. So that's the first thing. The second is, normally I'm the one asking the questions. It's the first time that it's otherwise since I've been here, and I'm glad that Danny is doing it. The next thing is, though, a few of you know me, and I have this mantra about how all things connect across time and place, and serendipity is what really guides the course of the universe, so that everything that Danny has described is in fact exactly the case, how we met at Theo's wedding, and how it was Linda Zeicherman who was the only one who said, "You're not nuts, this is something amazing for you to do." So all of this is the case. I do often ask, when I'm talking to guests here, I ask to hear their stories, and it's very important because of this point I mentioned about how all things do connect across time and around the globe. It's sort of interesting, and I think often about it, is it that it is only in retrospect that you realize how this continuous thread exists? Or do you feel it as you go along? And I think it's actually a combination as you make your way through life. And really, my story does go back. You did hear a little bit of it. It's fine that you heard that. I want to start with when I said yes about becoming director of the Jewish Museum, which was somewhere around August 13th, 2023.
That's my birthday.
I was going to do it the day before, and I said, no, I'll wait till Danny's birthday. You know, it's interesting. I am a modern art historian. That is my training. Carol and I went to school together, but she was in government, and I studied literature and art history. And the only thing I paid attention to was what happened in 1850 that triggered the shift to what would become modernism. I never thought about anything before 1850. Like, I'm sitting here on the stage, 1850 and beyond, not before. And I was just really lucky. I was a modern art historian. I ended up at MoMA. I stayed there a really long time. I'd never been to Israel. Like, I'd never been to Harvard Hillel when I was a student there. I don't even know where it was. I think it's in a different location now. And more recently, someone did point it out to me. I had never been to Harvard Hillel. I was asked totally out of the blue if I would consider becoming director of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And what motivated my getting on a plane in the darkness of night to make a quick 24-hour visit to Jerusalem on April 20th, 1996. Do you remember the Grapes of Wrath intervention from the north? It was happening exactly at that moment. What motivated my doing it was that I'm from the Midwest, my wife's from the Midwest. Our kids were growing up as hothouse New York kids who, just like that old New Yorker cover where New York was the center of the universe, they were clueless about the rest of the world. Life was according to a certain formula. This was not how Tina and I had been brought up. We wanted to get them out of that. Tina said, it might be good for the kids. It'll stretch them a bit. So I did go for 24 hours to Israel. And okay, I will go back to my story, but I don't know why this is, but something from day one always made me respond to the notion of site setting, landscape, and architecture as the backdrop for whatever. Later in life, it would be as the backdrop for neutral museum settings for telling cultural narratives. But earlier in life, it was just about the power of a place. I did grow up near Falling Water on the Ohio Powell River. I didn't know what it was, but I saw it quite often, and it was really powerful. And when I came to MoMA, I did learn over time about this notion of the power of place. And this incredible piece of iconic international modernism sitting on 53rd Street, in a way anonymous, on the other hand, like a billboard for a change, for an aesthetic change that happened early in the 20th century, and you saw it in this otherwise anonymous gray grid of Midtown Manhattan. And when I went to Jerusalem thinking that it would be good for our kids, you've all been to who's not been to the Israel Museum? You've all been there, or you're too shy to say so? If you've been there, you really know what I'm about to tell you. If you want a place that's about the power of site setting, landscape, and architecture as the neutral backdrop for telling a cultural narrative, that is the place. And I barely walked a third of the way up the promenade to find the entry. Oh, wait, this is Israel. So I passed the shanty town of temporary buildings at the front of the campus that had been built. Okay, we need a cafe. Okay, we need a ticket booth. And there was a gas station in front of the Shrine of the Book designed by Frederick Kiesler. I didn't even notice them. I went by them, and I'm walking up this promenade, and I'm seeing this unbelievable piece of international modernism, which is an icon for international modernism in Israel. And I'm seeing this Shrine of the Book by Frederick Kiesler and this garden by Isamu Noguchi. And I started to cry, and I called my wife, and I said, Tina, we are coming here. Her answer, well, all right, I will tell. Her answer was, are you nuts? Wait, we aren't from New York. We're from the Midwest. We lived in New York. Every time we'd go to LaGuardia to go somewhere and you'd pass all those cemeteries, Tina would say, that reminds me, do not bury me here. Bury me on the Mount of Olives. And I would say, what Mount of Olives? We don't know where that Mount of Olives is. Where is it? And so that was always something for us. And she said, are you nuts? I don't want to live there. I want to be buried there. And she called back 2 minutes later and she said, this could be good for the kids. And it was transformative for us. And we were there for 22 years, and it was incredible. And we came home when it was time to come home, and I thought my museum life, I'd done it enough. I'd done it for 44 years, and I started to run the Jerusalem Foundation. It was a way to live here and stay connected with Jerusalem, which has a lot of meaning for me. I did it for 5 years, and then this is where I said I was going to start. I'm sorry, I told you more of the story. I was called out of the blue and asked if I would consider becoming director of the Jewish Museum. And he's going to ask me, the Israel Museum is a universal museum. It tells the whole story from 1.5 million years ago to the present all around the globe. And for me, coming from MoMA, which is 150 years, to get to 1.5 million and really learn this story was something incredible. And I'd already started thinking about the notion of culturally specific museums. What role they can play now. And this is like post-COVID, this is in this challenging, before October 7, this challenging social and political climate that we live in. And I started thinking culturally specific museums might be the ones that can lead the way now, because they're about taking single cultures and looking at them not in isolation and not elevated above others, but thinking about how you acknowledge the landscape of other cultures around you, no matter when in time and where. and how you demonstrate the resonance between your culture and those other cultures. And so these guys called me, and I thought, I've never run a Jewish museum, but maybe this is a thing I should do. And I walked up Museum Mile, and here's this white whale of a limestone neo-Gothic double mansion house on Museum Mile, which is the Jewish Museum. And suddenly it's like site, setting, landscape, architecture. And I thought, God wants me to do this, and I said yes. And that was before October 7, and that changed the world. That's enough, and we'll continue.
I love it. So tell us a little bit about, picking up from there, what your vision was for the Jewish Museum as you took the job and were planning to begin, and how that changed after October 7th.
You know, it's really interesting, actually, because in a way, October 7 just amplified the importance of what I had started thinking about. And I get accused sometimes of making things sound easy. Nothing is easy, and this has not been easy. But I really was thinking as I came that a fresh mission for this place would be to demonstrate how a Jewish museum, which wants to be, if it has collections that can support this agenda, which wants to be about telling the story of 3,500 years of Jewish world culture, wandering in the global diaspora, resonating with all the cultures around it, no matter when and where, influencing them and being influenced by them. That was my thought before October 7. October 7 was 3 weeks before day one here. And on day one, without a second thought, I understood the importance of how this place needed to lead the way to start to be a platform for messaging, not politically, but rather culturally and against a social background about what had happened and how to wrestle with it, again, from a social and cultural perspective, not a political one. And I don't want to say I jumped the gun, because our board said to me, we know it's day one, but you have to write a message. Maybe a few of you got it. Some of you must. Oh, I'm not going to ask who's on the mailing list of the Jewish Museum. But we did write a message which said, we condemn savagery and brutality, and we call for the restoration of humanism, which is the core of our being. Museums exist to be custodians of world culture, and without humanism, there is no world culture. And our hearts and minds were with innocent Israelis and Palestinians caught in the crosshairs of conflict. That was our message, and we said, and we are going to develop an action plan for education and engagement for our staff, for our public, and for artists, and you'll hear about it soon. And you know, we did jump the gun in a way, because a few days later, a foundation in New York invited the 12 biggest museums in town to sit around the table together and talk about how to be responsive. Everyone had already seen my message, so I didn't have to say anything. But as we went around the table, everyone else said we're caught between a rock and a hard place, because our staffs are over here, our donors and our boards are over here, and social media, conflated with the complexity of the situation, is making it impossible for us to message or to position ourselves. And my response was, you don't have to take a position, but you need to be a platform for engagement using culture as the pathway. And everyone said, you're different from us. And I said, we're not different from you, that's the point. And that really was the launching pad for our focus since then.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you've been able to accomplish that mission? You had that action plan. What did that consist of? What are some exhibits you've had here, and what else have you done to achieve those goals of that kind of cultural education?
Well, you know, it's funny because it's not funny. Nothing has been funny since then. But of course, we, like every other museum, already had an exhibition program in place. Maybe some of you came and saw, I think we opened it on in the first week of November, an exhibition on Marta Minuchin. Did any of you see this? So Marta Minuchin is still alive. She's in her 80s, and she's been an action artist since the 1960s. She's from Buenos Aires. She came to New York. She was engaged with Andy Warhol, Yoko Ono, Kusama. She was part of the women's action art movement in her time here. And she was here for perhaps 10 years. She had a lot of visibility. She went back to South America, where today, 60 years later, she is still the most prominent. She's like the Kusama or the Taylor Swift of South America. Everyone knows her in South America. No one knows her in North America. And we did this amazing exhibition, and I thought, are we going to look tone deaf? But in fact, we didn't look tone deaf, because South America is a complicated place, and her country is a complicated country, and she really could not have been more engaged through all these decades as a cultural activist, and in a funny way, a practitioner of cultural diplomacy. And so to show her during this time actually had some meaning. So in terms of our program going forward, we've just been very thoughtful about what we're doing currently can be positioned to relate to the complexity of the time, and we've been doing that. But with regard to our action plan, it's really been very interesting. There are many diverse positions on our staff, and we started these monthly workshops for the staff, where we would bring everyone to sit in here, and we would bring great speakers to talk about civil discourse, to talk about racism and anti-Semitism, to talk about the history of the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire. And not everyone knows all these things today. And it's been very valuable to do this. And then we did start the series of monthly talks with cultural personalities to look at the state of the world today, again, from a cultural perspective, not talking about politics. And we did one a month from February until 2 weeks ago. And we started with Ruby Namdar. Any of you know him? An unbelievable, a Persian heritage Israeli Jew, born and raised in Israel, who lives here, writes fiction and nonfiction, writes fiction in Hebrew, which is then eloquently translated into English. And his fiction is amazing because it conflates everything from biblical times to the present. And the language is unbelievably poetic. And the stories, like Ruined House, his most famous book, the stories go down a black hole. And I wanted to start with him because, people aren't so knowledgeable here. He's a Jew from the East. He's an Arab Jew, in a way, you can say. He's Persian, but, more broadly. And to bring him to the stage really was something meaningful for people. And then we did the artist Zoya Cherkassky. I'll talk more about her in a moment. Then we did the artist Michal Rovner. And then I concluded with Tariq Masood, who's the head of the Middle East Initiative at the Kennedy School, where I'm a senior fellow. And he's an Egyptian-born Muslim. And we're quite close. So our talk was like Isaac and Ishmael, finding pathways to a different future. And again, nothing about politics, and it was kind of amazing. So that series
James refers
was really,
to Tariq as his brother from another diaspora.
Right. That's what, right, wait. I signed my emails to him YBFAD. That is how I describe our relationship. And so that series has been very public and very recognized. And we also, and this might be the most important thing, we started this series of installations of work by artists responding to trauma, either in their own time or in recent past or distant past. And we started with Zoya Cherkassky. I won't ask for hands, but I hope some of you saw the series of drawings we displayed, which she did. Zoya is in her 40s. She came at the age of 14 from the Soviet Union as an emigre to Israel in Tel Aviv. You may know that Soviet emigres in Israel are way down at the bottom of the social totem pole. and she's married to a Nigerian migrant worker even farther down. She's amazing. He's amazing. They have a daughter. They're like unbelievable. And right after October 7, she did a whole series of drawings, colored pencil and watercolor drawings, small format, which were such powerful depictions of what happened that we got hold of her gallery, said we must be the first and only place to show these. We got them really quickly. We installed them. We didn't do a press release. We weren't sort of taking advantage of the moment, but the press response was amazing. And the embrace of what we did was amazing. And it was really endorsing of what we were doing and have continued to do. And my talk with her was a packed house where actually the only time we've had an intervention of any kind was the night of my talk with Zoya, where we had a brief intervention that was taken out, and her eloquence was deeply moving. And doing all of this, two things. Doing all of this really has been very gratifying for us in a couple of ways. One is, again, we've not taken sides in any way. We have just underscored the importance of places like museums to be docking stations for engagement and reflection about the state of the world today, and doing it from a cultural perspective. And as a result, unlike the Met, MoMA, the Guggenheim, Brooklyn Museum, the Queens Museum, where there have been repeated protests, apart from our one brief intervention the night of our talk with Zoya, we are being respected for the approach we're taking.
I'd love to hear a little bit more. You talk about your relationship with Tarek, and you're being a senior fellow at the Kennedy School. I think that might surprise some people, right? You're an art historian and have been a director of museums for a long time. How did you become a fellow at the Kennedy School, and what's that been like this year?
So this is really interesting. Well, we are all Harvard people. Many of us had never been to Harvard. Maybe you'll invite us to Harvard Hillel.
You're all invited.
And
Next Shabbat, join us for dinner.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting. Probably more than 10 years ago, an undergraduate at Harvard from Israel started the Harvard Israel Trek, and we became very involved with it at the Israel Museum.
The Harvard Israel Trek is a trek designed and led by Israeli Harvard undergraduates who take students to Israel, mostly non-Jewish students. So we have Birthright for Jewish students and the Trek for non-Jews.
You know, it's interesting. All of our years in Israel, I interviewed for Harvard College. Only once did I really push to get a kid in. His name is Zaki Jamal, and he's amazing. We're still quite close. He was unbelievable. He got in, he went to Harvard, and he started the Harvard Israel Trek. And it is an annual trip, mostly for we were also very involved with Birthright at the Israel Museum because we really helped them develop the cultural side of the program. Harvard Israel Trek is for mostly non-Jewish kids during spring break. And I don't want to say it's an alternative, but it wants to be a very balanced look at Israel-Palestine from Israel. There are no visits to the West Bank or outside of Israel.
No, that's not true anymore.
It's changed in recent years. And it's fantastic. And so that was happening every year. And then I got a call about a Harvard Dean's immersion trip. I think it was for the summer. It was for the summer of 2017 or 18. And it was deans from most of the Harvard schools. And Tariq Massoud came to sort of escort the trip because of his role as the head of the Middle East Initiative at the Kennedy School. And I had been traveling, and it was my last year at the museum, and I arrived back on what was their last day after a full week of going everywhere. And clearly they hadn't had fun. They did not. I met them. I met them sort of as you ascend the promenade to enter the Israel Museum, the place where I wept for joy, and they looked really cranky. And we spent 2 hours in the museum, at the end of which they were really beginning to seem elevated. And then we went to the village of Abu Ghosh. This was on a Saturday. to the village of Abu Ghosh for a fantastic lunch at the Abu Ghosh restaurant, where I'd invited David Grossman to come so that he and I could do a conversation with him. We were surrounded by bougainvillea. The food was unbelievable. And these folks were so happy. And Tarek and I became really brothers from different diasporas that afternoon. And I had, and actually still have, a 1995 midnight blue Volvo 940 station wagon. It's longer than this stage. And it's really hard to park in Abu Ghosh, and I needed to back up into a space on the sidewalk, and there was no way I was going to do it, and Tarek said, I will do it. And he did it. And then he went home, and he wrote me this beautiful letter signed by him and by the dean at the Kennedy School, saying that after their experience together with me, I guess parking the car, they felt that I should become a senior fellow at the Kennedy School to bring culture to the syllabus of the Kennedy School, which is otherwise only about politics and public policy. So that's how I got there.
And tell us about what do you do there, and what's that been like since October 7th?
Well, this is two different stories, and it's really interesting. So my first visit there was like February 20th, 2020. And it was amazing. I just wanted to cry. I do cry easily. I wanted to cry. It's like it was the life of the mind. And you know, it was opening a door for the Kennedy School. You're all Harvard people. You know that all these great schools don't talk to each other. And suddenly we were looping everybody in, and I was there for 3 or 4 days, and we were planning all kinds of things. And 2 weeks later, COVID happened. And our initial plan was that every month I would come and bring a cultural personality from the Middle East for a couple of days, do a big talk, meet with students, and then the Tarek and I would develop a syllabus for a course called Art and Politics, Politics and Art, which could be about the ways in which art and politics resonate and have resonated over time. We happened to pick 3,500 years for a bunch of reasons. And then COVID happened, and it was very frustrating on the one hand. On the other hand, for a couple of years, every month, I was able to do on Zoom an incredible talk with figures that would never have gotten on a plane to, what's that French word? Schlep. Schlep from Israel to Cambridge. And you know, they're all somewhere. You can find them. You can find them. And it was really amazing. And a lot of incredible figures. I mean, not to bring up David Grossman again, but he never leaves his house. He's sitting there writing. And we had an amazing talk. Or Ohad Naharin, you know, the guy that, the founder of Batsheva, who danced with Martha Graham, went home and created Batsheva Dance Company. He'll be on this stage tomorrow night. You know, these folks wouldn't leave the region. And so that really was very enriching. And we couldn't do a seminar. And then finally, this year, we had planned to get back on site. We had planned 4 for the fall, 4 for the spring. We were hoping to do the course this spring. And then October 7 happened. And it changed our experience completely. We were actually going to have the first visit at the end of October, and there's an NGO in Jerusalem called Field Bet. It's an incredible site on the Tayelet, you know, to the south of the Peace Forest, looking at the Temple Mount, and it happens to be between Abu Tor and Silwan. So it happens to be a kind of seamless boundary between Israel and Palestine, and it's a venue for visual and performative arts. And we were going to do, I was bringing the head of the program and the head of their Arab program. And you know, that was October 6th. And October 7th, it seemed gratuitous to do that. So all of that programming was canceled. And I have been a couple of times, mostly quietly, just to sit with Jewish and Israeli students and talk to them about how they were feeling engaged or disengaged during the course of the year.
I'd love to hear more. You know, I hear on the one hand you talk about how museums can play this role of cultural diplomacy in some ways it sounds like you're saying to be apolitical, and then you talk about this class you're working on with Tarek, politics and art. So what is the relationship between politics and art, and how can art relate to politics? How apolitical can it be? How apolitical should it be?
Well, this is really interesting, and again, it's not anything that I ever thought about, although, well, after this you can go downstairs and see a show that I'm going to talk to you about a little bit. But it is really interesting. You think of, it's not that art and politics necessarily connect with one another, but it is that art at any moment in time, of course, absorbs what's happening around the maker, and it radiates a response to what's happening. So that's sort of one side of it. And the other side of it is that political events can stimulate art making. Picasso's Guernica. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but you all know Picasso's Guernica. So this is a Spanish Civil War response. That is exactly what he was responding to, and he was trying to elicit a response through art. So this is like blatant, you might call it blatant art activism. So sometimes that does happen, but mostly it's just that creative making responds to what is happening around you and what has happened cumulatively through your creative growth. And so, perforce, creative making absorbs and reflects the sociology and the politics of the time in which it's made. And our course, which hopefully one day, now we're hoping to do it next fall, goes back 3,500 years and comes to the present and looks at that.
I'm curious maybe to get into some detail. I think for those of us in the diaspora, we have a constant question of what is the role that Israel can and should play in Jewish diasporic life. And for you now as the director of the Jewish Museum in New York, what role does Israel play here in this museum?
Now this is really interesting. I'm new. After spending 20-some years in Israel, I do know the creative community there. And it's funny, you don't want to call it Israeli art as distinct from Palestinian art, but art there is made in all of the communities. And we arrived in '96, and the Second Intifada was a few years later. Before the Second Intifada, we at the Israel Museum actually showed what today we would call Palestinian and Israeli art together. And it was no big deal. I mean, we did projects with artists from Jordan, artists from Egypt, and from the West Bank, and it was really pretty extraordinary. Once the Second Intifada happened, that stopped. But we, or I should say I, and we in the museum stayed very connected to that creative making throughout the region. I arrived here, and this isn't a critical comment, it's just analytical. The Jewish Museum hasn't, in the last many years, paid so much attention to creative making from the Middle East. And it's not just about Israel-Palestine, it's the whole Mediterranean basin, and it's something that's really quite interesting. So again, even before I got here and before October 7, the idea that we would do more with art from the region is already on the table. And we are, and we will. And we'll get to the Venice Biennale. Did anyone go to the, okay, show of hands. Did anyone go to the Venice Biennale yet? You're all going to go after you hear what we're going to talk about.
So that was my next question. Inform us about the events that happened at the Venice Biennale. You were also just there, and your reaction to what's going on.
So, this is a great story. The subject of the Venice Biennale this year is foreigners everywhere. And look, this is a big thing. Forget October 7. The global migration crisis is something that many of us have been following for a number of years. Some of you we did an exhibition in 2017 at the Israel Museum with Ai Weiwei, who then was in the region making a very long, documentaries are supposed to be like 55 minutes. This was 3 hours. And it was about 100 million people uprooted and migrating globally. And it was deeply touching. And he did come to the region to film in Gaza as sort of counterpoint, because Gaza, in his interpretation, was a place where these refugees weren't uprooted and migrating. They couldn't leave where they were. And it was very touching to hear this story in his documentary. And then we did an exhibition with him at the museum, which was really quite moving, because it was about the resonance of cultural connection between Chinese people and Jewish people. And it got a huge amount of attention for being about that. So that sort of lays the groundwork for this year's Biennale, where the theme is foreigners everywhere, and where the curator's concept, which couldn't have been more timely or appropriate, wanted to be about artists from everywhere who now live and work and whose creative making is inspired by where they are today, not where they began. I can't say that it succeeds 100%, but the resonance of seeing all this work is quite moving. But then, particularly, some of the national pavilions are really strong. The Nigerian pavilion, where the theme is based on the plundering of the Benin bronzes and contemporary artists responding. And that's a little bit explicit, but then contemporary artists, young artists who are creating new vocabularies that resonate with the sort of PTSD of that cultural experience. But then particularly moving are the Egyptian pavilion and the Israel pavilion. And you probably all know that the Israel pavilion didn't open. Do you all know that? Yes. Okay. Now the story is really something. Because of our history and connection there, and because of knowing the artist and knowing the curators, we were involved from day one with this story. And there was a move, there was an action to boycott the Israel pavilion and have it canceled. The Italian Ministry of Culture and the government refused, and the question to us was, should we continue? And the answer was, of course, keep your head down, keep moving ahead, and do something brilliant. And they did. I won't describe it, you'll see it. And actually, you may have an opportunity to see it locally if it doesn't open there. And 2 days before the opening, the night before we left to go to Venice, in part to be with them and be supportive, the two curators and the artist called and said, listen, here's what we're going to do, we think. We are going to, on the morning of the press opening, without any prior notice, we're going to put up a big sign on the big glass window through which you could look at some of the video works. The artist is a video artist. Some of the video work in the exhibition, and it will say very simply that the pavilion is closed. We will open when there is peace and when hostages are released, and we look forward to welcoming you then. And they said, does this upset you? And I said, I think it's brilliant, because you're taking ownership of the moment. You are deciding not to open. This is like art activism and cultural diplomacy at its very best. If they had opened, the level of protest would have been violent to a point that I don't even want to imagine, and they would have been forced to close, not by their own doing. And what they did expresses ownership and dignity. And, there was some pushback on day one. We got to be among those sending out a message saying how proud we were of this decision, and they're still closed. And frankly, the American Pavilion is next door, and it's the Native American artist, what's his first name? Jeffrey Gibson. And it's pretty good. It's not amazing. It's pretty good. But on that first day, because the Israel Pavilion was closed, the 1,500 people that gathered to do a pro-Palestinian protest action against the Israel Pavilion gathered in front of the U.S. Pavilion. I was there the whole time. It wasn't pretty. And it really reinforced the notion of pride in the decision of the Israel Pavilion. Now, they'll open if good things happen. If they don't, we have already expressed that we might want to move things around here so that we can show this exhibition after the Biennale closes. And I think as endorsement, you know, we're in this period, you've read about this, it's in the papers all the time, of boycotting Israeli and Jewish institutions of all kinds, and particularly cultural institutions and artists. So to do this will be a very, again, there's nothing political about it. This is cultural engagement, and if you want to call it activism, it's cultural. And we would do that.
And can you say more about why you're proud of that decision? Because I think many would hear that as saying, it's understandable why you don't want to get protested, but you are giving in to those who are going to attack you and kind of preemptively self-censoring. So what makes you so proud about that form of taking agency?
It's taking ownership and making their own decision and not having a decision forced on them by others.
Even though it means that their work isn't being seen and they're shutting it down?
Well, you can see it through the window, and you know, for the artist, there was and honestly, many, don't quote me, many years the Israel Pavilion is not great. This one is fantastic, and it resonates. The Egypt Pavilion is like 2 pavilions away. I won't make this joke. Only the Gaza Pavilion is in between. I didn't say that. The Egypt Pavilion is 2 pavilions away. The artist is amazing. He is an Egyptian Muslim from Alexandria. He happens to teach at Penn every fall semester, so he'll be here in the fall. He's incredible. He's also a video artist, as the Israeli artist is. And for our talk series in the fall, I'm hoping to bring the Israeli artist and the Egyptian artist, and he's ready, willing, and able to do it. And if we can show his work here, which he's ready, willing, and able to do, we're going to do that also. This really is where culture can play a non-political and positive and activist role, and we just believe very strongly in it.
I want to ask you one final question. Who are some figures within Israel in the art scene and the cultural scene that you think our community here may not know about, that you think we should know about?
Well, I don't know if you don't know about them, but there really are some figures of, come tomorrow night, listen to Ohad Naharin. You know, the eloquence of these people, and again, the dignity and the pride and the ownership relating to what they do is just something that is very, very moving. And you know, I wouldn't say that there's secrets there. Maybe you don't know Ruby Namdar, but read Ruined House, and then just look him up in the phone book and call him up and meet him. You know, the eloquence and the kind of depth of thoughtfulness in the creative community there is really something that's quite moving. And this is also, and again, you know, it didn't used to be about Palestinians and Israelis, although those are good terms, actually. Because instead of searching, you know, how everyone would always say Arabs and Jews, which is wrong, because you have Arabs who are Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. And so this is not good language. Palestinian and Israelis are good, usable terms. At the moment, it seems to push them apart, but in terms of the cultural community, there's a very deep engagement. There is the town of El-Fachem, as you go up to the north, which is just on the border of the West Bank, but it's in Israel, but it's really a Palestinian town. And there's an art center there that is very, very supportive of the Palestinian art community. Now, and if you go back to the 1930s, when all these Europeans were arriving to the Holy Land, to Palestine, you would come to Haifa. There was no airport. And a lot of these were artists, the same as the artists that came to New York and got famous later, because fast forward, after World War II, they would show at the Jewish Museum for the first time and get famous. And so there was a real mix of cultures. Haifa is the future. There was a real mix of cultures then, and it's a well-kept secret, but it's true today. And if you look at the history of art in Israel over the last 100 years, it's incredibly integrated between those communities. So the director of El-Fahim Gallery, Museum, whatever it's called, came to see me 2 days ago, and I said to him, listen, can we integrate you into this program of ours? Can I bring you as a speaker? Will you speak to the staff? Can we do an exhibition? And if you, again, go back to before the founding of the state, photography was a big medium in Palestine before the state of Israel, because these Europeans were coming to Haifa and the locals were learning to use cameras. And it's really a fascinating story to see what kinds of images the Jewish photographers were making and what kinds of images the Arab, the local Arab community photographers were taking, and it would be a great show to do here. And I said to him, let's do this, and he's all for it. So there's really a lot of potential for this kind of stuff.
Thank you, James. Getting to hear from James is really the focus of tonight's program. But we're also sitting at a very important moment for Harvard Hillel. Of course, many of you have concerns what's going on Harvard's campus and other campuses. And I would say the first move that any organization should do to lead in this way is to pick one of the most brilliant, thoughtful people to run your organization. So we'll have a chance in a moment to hear from our incoming executive director briefly. But James, I just want to thank you for your thoughtfulness and really your eternal optimism in the face of such challenging moments.
And Danny, thank you for bringing your Harvard Hillel crowd here. Oh, wait, and before you go, so our current exhibition program happens to be timely. Straight ahead that way is this exhibition on Frederick Kiesler's vision machines. You know about Frederick Kiesler. He was a conceptual architect. His only permanently executed building is the Shrine of the Book on the campus of the Israel Museum. But in the late 30s, he taught at Columbia in their conceptual architecture program, and he had this crazy idea of a mobile home library. So wherever you went, you could take your library of 348 books with you and have it with you. Of course, he never built it. And, you know, we started thinking that it's like that was the first iteration of what is now this thing you carry in your pocket that has all of your knowledge. And we executed it, and it is here. And the show is really great, and it's about this analog beginning to the digital age of personal knowledge. So that's one, but downstairs, and just give me a moment if I can. Downstairs is a show called Overflow Afterglow, and it's 7 emerging artists, 5 of whom have Jewish heritage, and some of the 5 of whom identify with that heritage. Their families are from all over the world, but all but one actually was born in the US. They mostly now live in and around New York. They are emerging. 4 of them are in their 30s, 3 of them are in their early 40s. And they were invited by our contemporary curator to do an exhibition surfacing her observance of a phenomenon of a new visual vocabulary being created by artists who have grown up in the last 20 years, who were kids or early teens at 9/11 and who have experienced all the trauma, not of October 7, but of the last 20 years. And the thesis is looking at young emerging artists whose work absorbs and resonates with the challenges of the times in which they have grown up. So in their case, making new visual vocabularies that use color and depictions of the figure in new ways. Now, this for the Jewish Museum is a kind of recurring theme, because after World War II, I hope you all know this, as all these artists emigrated from Europe and were trying to recover from the trauma of World War II, and a number of them were responsible for creating the new visual vocabulary that would become vocabularies that would become abstraction and then minimalism. And they were all shown here for the first time ever. This museum was responsible for shifting the spotlight on contemporary art from Europe to America, because it was the first museum to show Rauschenberg, Johns, Ad Reinhardt, Barnett Newman, Philip Guston. They all started here, and for many of them, their heritage, they were Jewish by heritage, and they were culturally Jewish, but they struggled with not being religiously Jewish. And they created these new visual vocabularies, and that's what we got famous for showing. So this exhibition wants to revive that heritage, looking at artists emerging today who are creating new vocabularies, emerging from the trauma of their growing up during these last 20 years here. It's really interesting, and we opened last week. Two things happened. The New Yorker did its season preview, and in art, they listed this as the #1 exhibition in New York in contemporary art for this coming season. That's one. And two, you can't imagine how buzzy the crowd was that was here last Tuesday. I was the only one wearing, like, a suit and a tie. And with white hair.
Thank you, James.
So, Danny, thank you, and it's great to be here with you.
A little over a year ago, when our then executive director, Rabbi Jonah Steinberg, announced that he was departing Harvard Hillel, I reached out to Jason and said, please come and be my boss. And it took a little bit of time until that materialized. But Jason, I just wanted to share, and I want to introduce all of you to Jason with some words that I actually shared with Jason 13 years ago. We were in the same fellowship together, and he was 1 year ahead of me, and I got the honor to toast Jason as he was graduating. And this is what I wrote to him then. Jason, long before meeting you, I knew of your reputation as a deeply curious, passionate Talmid Chacham, a scholar. Although I had heard about how gentle and kind you were, I was shaking with anticipation when I first met you at a conference. So much so that I immediately spilled soy milk all over you at the breakfast bar. Unflinchingly, you continued to engage me in conversation, maintaining eye contact all along, even as you cleaned up. Thus began years of conversations about halachic Jewish legal values, Jewish identity, and experiences of God. Through our conversations, you've enabled me to experience the truth of the Mishnah, of the rabbinic teaching. When two people sit and engage in words of Torah, God's presence dwells between them. I cherish our interactions and pray there will be many more to nourish my soul. We are really, truly blessed as a community to have Rabbi Jason Rubenstein as our incoming director starting next week, and please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that, Donnie. I remember the saddest part of graduating that fellowship was losing my biannual pilgrimage to see you and to speak, most of which were drier than that first encounter. Last week, I was up at what used to be Hillel Library when we celebrated the first ever Jewish commencement of Harvard. And there were about this many students from the college, from the graduate and professional schools. And I had the joy of welcoming them into an alumni community from which they would never leave. And you all, by being here tonight, are instantiating and strengthening and continuing that community. And I want to say how that the experiences at Harvard Hillel and of being that community, my wife is a Harvard alum, is daily in our house, is the deepest and sweetest part of our lives. And I want to take a moment just to reflect on what we've just heard, the image of the kind of relentless, unflinching power and dedication to Jewish creativity, even and especially in the face of trauma. The two stories that I keep coming back to of Jewish students encountering hatred and ugly, thoughtless hatred after October 7th are different variations of the same story, and since they're Jewish stories, they're not really new. One is a student, an Orthodox student. You'll forgive me, these are Yale stories. That's what I have from the last 6 years. I'm looking forward to acquiring Harvard ones also. A student from an Orthodox family, quite an Orthodox family, and he told me, this was, as things were getting really ugly on campus around Israel, he said, my uncles, who are really not modern Orthodox, said, Avi, why are you going to study Yale? At Yale, Jews study in yeshiva. That's where we learn how to think. It's where we learn values. And Avi said, no, there are people there, there are ways of thinking there that I want not just to be exposed to, but to make part of my life and who I am and what I move through the world with. And he said, after seeing when the chips are down or the stakes are high, commitments to multiple perspectives or historical truth or critical distance from your own intuitions are all thrown out the window, he said, I start to wonder whether my uncles were right. The second story is from a student whose family is from the former Soviet Union, and he said, for me, being on a college campus the last few months, the primary loss has been one of pride. He said, getting into Yale was the thing I was proudest of. And now seeing the ways people around this campus think, or really better, don't think when they're called to, makes me feel like being associated with this group is no longer something I'm particularly proud of. And so it's not to say that Jewish students haven't been harmed or scared or silenced. All those things are true, and they shouldn't be downplayed or gainsaid, and we need to think about what that means for the coming years and generations of American higher education. And at the same time, the primary, the center, the kind of the epicenter, the harm is in their capacity to believe in and to trust the institutions and the values and the traditions of liberalism. And the text that I keep coming back to again and again in talking with these students is imagining a young Theodor Herzl, right, dispatched from Vienna to cover the Dreyfus trial. And in that moment of betrayal, right, what do you do? The Talmud has an image for this, which is an image of creativity, about creativity. It says, it takes the verse, and you need a little bit of Hebrew orthography here. The verse, Ein Tzur Kelohenu, there's no rock like our God. Now, there are a few theological images that are more reliable than the image of God as a rock and a refuge. The rabbis are never happy with the merely reliable. Eve Sedgwick, the great Jewish literary critic, said the point of the Talmud is to unfold the meaning of the text and to giggle. And here's a giggle. I said it actually should read Ein Sayar Kelohenu. There's no artist like our God. Incredible play, right? Rather than the ultimate bastion of safety and strength and solidity, to the ultimate playfulness. Imagine God almost as with a paintbrush drawing on the colors of creation. But there's something more, that what the rabbis are doing actually is not just a word play. There's something in the visual art of the Torah. If you imagine the letters of Tzur, right, the middle is a Vav, which is kind of vertical line. And in turning the word into Tsayar, or the vertical line of the Vav is replaced by a pair of Yuds, they're actually just taking the line and breaking it in two, making it a pair of ink blots that they rearrange. And that image, right, the historical Jewish image that resonates most and most tragically there is in Dreyfus's trial. He was subjected to a humiliation in a military courtyard on a Shabbat morning in 1894 in Paris, where his sword was taken off of his uniform and shattered in two, right, this straight line being ruptured into a pair of short segments. And so what does it mean to create for Herzl? It was a creativity that was political that led to his being interred just a few hilltops away from that promenade that you were ascending when you cried a generation ago. And it's a creativity that takes so many other forms, and it's a creativity that's happening on this stage, not just tonight, but apparently many other nights that we can and should return for. And it's a creativity that's happening in the hearts and minds and souls of Jewish students at Harvard and around the world. And what I want to invite you into is a partnership of, the swords have been broken, the rocks have been shattered. And the work is not only to repair them, although it also is, but it might even be more profoundly to help our students as they, like the Herzls of a century ago, and like the Jameses of a generation ago, encountering a timeless Jewish reality, and like our rabbis of 2 millennia ago, as they figure out how and what they will create precisely after the rocks and the swords have been broken. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight and invite you into that work of creating that together. And with that, I'm going to call up our really wonderful board member, Linda Busking, who's been the heart and soul behind this whole evening.
So thank you so much all for being here. Who would have known that Donnie and James and Harvard Hillel and the Jewish Museum would have the fortune of having so many people gather together. We didn't realize so many of you were actually going to show up, so we apologize for the tumult at the beginning of this gathering and the fact that we couldn't let everyone in immediately. We're so happy that you're here, though, and hope you'll have a chance to stay with us for a little bit. So I joined the board of Harvard Hillel a couple of years ago. I had not been involved at Hillel as an undergrad, but really became very passionate about wanting to see this organization be there for young Jews in the community to gather and celebrate and nurture their Jewish identities and Jewish lives, and for their parents to feel confident that Hillel would be there for them. So we are grateful that Hillel is this strong organization and that we have Jason with us to lead this organization. He actually is headed from here to his reunion and then becomes our executive director on Saturday. So we're the first to see him wear his name tag with an executive director label on it. Just wanted to make sure everyone is aware and understands that Hillel is a completely independent organization from Harvard University. And every year we raise money to support the extraordinary work that goes on in the community. Wonderful speaker series like Donnie has created for us, all kinds of programming for undergraduate and graduate students, and opportunities to bring alumni together. So we hope you'll really consider giving a gift to Hillel and supporting this work. It is so important now. Clearly, Hillel needs us, and Harvard needs us to be there for the community. So we hope you will consider supporting us. We also welcome you to take your time, enjoy gathering and meeting with some refreshments in the back, and you are free, I believe, to tour the exhibitions on this floor and the floor below. So thank you all for being here. Thanks.